My mother ignored my birthday like the day I was born was a typo on the family calendar. But 48 hours later, when my father saw my $95,000 Tesla roll into the lot, he did not get angry. He panicked. By the time he called an emergency family meeting, I understood. They were not reaching out because they missed me. They were scrambling to protect a financial secret they never wanted me to find. I am Skyla Flores, and on the day I turned 33, the silence was the loudest thing in my apartment. I live in Tempe, Arizona, a city that bakes under a relentless sun for 9 months of the year, where the air shimmers above the asphalt like a mirage. I like the heat. It burns away the unnecessary things. As a senior pricing strategist for Solstice Vector Mobility, a rapidly expanding electric vehicle infrastructure firm, my daily life revolves around margins, forecasts, and eliminating inefficiencies. I am good at my job because I understand value. I know exactly what things cost, and more importantly, I know what people are willing to pay for them. Apparently, my family had decided my value was exactly zero. I did not expect a grand gesture. I outgrew the fantasy of surprise parties and ribbon-tied boxes a long time ago. All I waited for was a simple phone call, or even a brief text message from my mother, Denise Flores. Just a few tapped words on a screen to acknowledge that 33 years ago, she brought me into the world. It was not an unreasonable expectation, considering the elaborate, catered affairs she orchestrated every single year for my younger brother, Roman. For his 30th, she rented out a private vineyard and hired a string quartet. For my 32nd, she sent a group text that included 2 wrong numbers. This year, the bar had somehow dropped even lower. Throughout the entire workday, my phone sat on my sleek glass desk, its screen remaining dark. I checked it between conference calls and spreadsheet audits. Nothing. During my lunch hour, I posted a brief, unassuming photo on my social media story, just a cup of coffee with a small pastry, captioned with a quiet nod to another year older. Within 45 minutes, the little eye icon at the bottom of the screen indicated that Denise Flores had viewed it. She saw it, she knew, and she chose to swipe past it without leaving a single word. My father, Victor Flores, was equally absent. No missed calls, no voicemails, but the true masterpiece of their cruelty arrived at 7 o'clock in the evening. I was sitting on my velvet sofa, nursing a glass of dry red wine. When I opened the app again, Roman had just posted a new picture. It was a high-resolution shot taken at a notoriously expensive steakhouse in downtown Phoenix. Roman sat in the center, a smug smile plastered across his face, holding up a glass of scotch. Flanking him were Denise and Victor, beaming with the kind of unfiltered joy they usually reserved for finding a loophole in a tax document. The caption read, "Tuesday night, treating the parents. Family first." That was the specific gravity of the pain. It did not stem from the possibility that they had simply forgotten my birthday in the rush of everyday life. No, they remembered exactly what day it was. They just deliberately coordinated their schedules, made a reservation, and spent hundreds of dollars on a lavish dinner together, explicitly choosing to exclude me. It was a surgical strike. It was the same methodology they had employed for over a decade. I was the child who existed on the periphery, the one expected to demand nothing and absorb everything so the core unit could thrive without friction. I set the phone down face down on the marble coffee table. I did not cry. Tears require a certain level of shock, and I was entirely out of that currency. Instead, I dressed in a sharp, tailored black dress and took myself out to a quiet, immaculate sushi restaurant where the omakase menu cost more than my first car. I ate alone, savoring each piece, letting the perfection of the meal wash over the sting of rejection. After dinner, I walked out to the valet stand. When the attendant pulled my car around, the sleek, phantom black silhouette of my newly delivered Tesla Model S Plaid glided perfectly under the ambient streetlights. I slipped into the driver's seat, the minimalist white interior wrapping around me like a bespoke suit. I did not buy this $95,000 machine with a single dime of family money. It was the direct result of a massive retention bonus and the vesting of my stock options following an aggressive internal merger at Solstice Vector Mobility. I worked 80-hour weeks for 18 months straight to earn it. I did not post pictures of it online. I did not drive it to family gatherings to show off. To me, it was not a status symbol. It was a silent, vibrating testament to the miles I had put between myself and the people who viewed me as nothing more than a sacrificial lamb to keep the household peace. I drove the long way home, letting the silent, instant torque push me back into the seat. The city lights blurred into streaks of gold and crimson. By the time I returned to my apartment, the clock read 11:15. The day was almost over. I poured myself another half glass of wine and opened a lower drawer in my credenza, pulling out a heavy leather-bound album of old family photographs. I flipped through the stiff pages, the plastic sleeves catching the overhead light, as I looked at the frozen smiles from high school graduations and awkward holiday dinners. A distinct, ugly pattern emerged in my mind. A cold realization settled in my chest. When did my family actually initiate contact with me? The answer was never to check on my well-being. They only ever reached out when they needed something tangible. A signature on a lease agreement they promised was just a formality. A co-signer to leverage my pristine credit score because Roman had defaulted on yet another brilliant business venture. Or, simply, a scapegoat to blame when Victor's financial gambles went sideways. My phone buzzed, vibrating against the wood of the table. I stared at it for a long moment before picking it up. It was a text message from Tessa Monroe, my closest friend and a ruthlessly effective commercial lawyer. Happy late birthday, you absolute workaholic. The message read, "Hope you did something fiercely expensive for yourself today. Also, just a standard legal disclaimer. If your family randomly calls you this week, do not sign anything. Drink water. Love you." Tessa meant it as a dark joke. We had shared enough late-night conversations over gin and tonics for her to know the exact rhythm of my family's dysfunction. But reading those words in the quiet isolation of my kitchen, a deep, unsettling chill radiated through my stomach. The joke felt too heavy. It carried the weight of a premonition. I set the phone down and walked over to the kitchen counter. Earlier, I had bought a single, artisanal red velvet cupcake from a bakery down the street. I unwrapped it from its pristine white box and struck a match, lighting the single, solitary candle I had pressed into the frosting. The small flame flickered, casting long, dancing shadows against the backsplash. I stood there in the absolute quiet of my immaculate apartment, surrounded by the life I had built entirely on my own. I watched the wax begin to melt and pool into the dark red cake. I did not close my eyes. I did not make a wish. Wishes were for people who still believed the universe owed them something. I leaned in and blew out the flame, watching the thin ribbon of gray smoke rise and disappear into the ventilation grate. I went to sleep that night believing the absolute worst thing my family had done was ignore my 33rd birthday. I had no idea that their orchestrated silence was merely the opening act. It was the quiet, calculated deep breath before the plunge. It was the prologue to the most brutal, methodical legal counterattack of my entire life, a war that was already rushing toward me, disguised as a misunderstanding. Exactly 48 hours after blowing out that solitary candle, I found myself pulling into the circular, palm-lined driveway of the Crescent Vale Hotel. The Crescent Vale is an opulent, Mediterranean-inspired fortress tucked into the wealthiest enclave of Paradise Valley, a place where the gravel in the driveway probably costs more than my college tuition. The dinner was strictly business. Solstice Vector Mobility was in the final, aggressive stages of negotiating a continent-wide charging station rollout with a major commercial real estate conglomerate. My role as the senior pricing strategist was to sit at that mahogany table, project absolute authority, and ensure our profit margins were protected down to the final cent. I needed absolute focus. I needed my mind sharp, unbothered by the lingering ghost of a forgotten birthday. The valet attendant, a young man in a crisp white uniform, stepped forward as the silent engine of my vehicle glided to a halt under the massive, chandelier-lit portico. I stepped out, handing him the electronic keycard. The evening air was still warm, carrying the faint, manufactured scent of blooming jasmine from the hotel gardens. I adjusted the lapels of my tailored charcoal blazer, preparing to walk inside and dominate the negotiation. That was when I saw him, less than 30 feet away, standing near a row of imported luxury sedans, was my father. Victor Flores was engaged in an animated, hushed conversation with a man I instantly recognized as the sleazy, fast-talking real estate broker our family had used for various questionable property flips over the last 15 years. My father was gesturing wildly, his usual aggressive posture on full display. I froze, a primal instinct kicking in. I expected him to turn, spot me, and launch into his typical theatrical routine. The Victor I knew would have marched straight across the cobblestones, his voice booming for everyone to hear. He would have looked at the $95,000 electric vehicle, sneered, and asked which predatory loan I had taken out to afford a rental for the night. He would have asked if I was dating a wealthy executive, implying that I could never acquire such an asset on my own merit. He loved performing his dominance, especially in public spaces where he felt outclassed by the architecture, but that is not what happened. My father turned his head and locked eyes with me. His gaze shifted from my face, down to my expensive suit, and finally landed on the sleek, undeniable reality of the Tesla as the valet drove it away toward the VIP parking section. I braced myself for the verbal assault. I waited for the heavy footsteps. Instead, the most unsettling thing occurred. Victor went entirely pale. The aggressive, ruddy color drained from his cheeks in a matter of 2 seconds. He stood completely still, his mouth slightly open, as if the oxygen had been vacuumed directly out of his lungs. He looked at the car. He looked at the valet ticket in my hand, and then he looked back at me. It was not a look of anger. It was not a look of jealousy or parental disapproval. It was the terrified, calculating stare of a man who had just stepped on a landmine and heard the click, waiting for the explosion. He realized, in that split second, that I was no longer the struggling, compliant daughter he could easily manipulate. He saw a woman with genuine, independent financial resources. Without saying a single word to me, my father abruptly turned his back. He practically shoved the real estate broker aside, pulled his cellular phone from his breast pocket with shaking hands, and walked rapidly toward the darkest corner of the parking lot, pressing the device to his ear. I walked into the hotel lobby, my pulse thrumming a slow, dangerous rhythm against my throat. I checked my coat, met my clients, and sat down at the private dining table. I ordered a glass of sparkling water, forcing my mind to compartmentalize the bizarre encounter outside. Exactly 8 minutes later, my phone vibrated in my purse. I pulled it out under the table. It was a text message from Denise. My mother, who had not spoken to me in months, who had completely ignored my existence 2 days prior, had suddenly found her thumbs. "Come home tonight. Family needs to talk. Important." There was no greeting, no apology for the silence, just a sharp, commanding directive. Before I could even process the audacity of her demand, a second notification popped up on my screen. This one was from my brother, Roman. "Please do not get mad." His message read, "It is just a paperwork misunderstanding. Everything is fine. Just come over after your dinner." I stared at the glowing screen, the words burning themselves into my retinas. The temperature in the private dining room seemed to drop by 10 degrees. My stomach plummeted, twisting into a tight, freezing knot. In the Flores family vocabulary, the word paperwork was never used casually. We did not use that word for birth certificates, college applications, or simple administrative tasks. In our house, paperwork was a camouflage word. It was the term they deployed when a final notice arrived from a collection agency. It was the word they used when a bank threatened to foreclose on a poorly judged investment property. It was the word that signaled fraud, debt, and the desperate scrambling to hide a financial disaster from the authorities. They had coordinated this. The timing was too perfect. Denise playing the tough matriarch demanding my presence, and Roman immediately following up with a soft, pacifying lie. They had rehearsed this exact sequence. but they were doing it in a state of absolute panic, triggered entirely by Victor seeing my car. I excused myself from the table, claiming I needed to make an urgent call to my director. I walked briskly down the long, carpeted hallway until I reached the privacy of the ladies' room. I locked myself inside a marble stall and dialed Tessa's number. She answered on the second ring. I quickly explained the timeline: the ignored birthday, the encounter with Victor at the valet, his visceral panic, and the sudden, highly synchronized text messages demanding a family meeting about a paperwork misunderstanding. Tessa did not gasp. She did not offer emotional comfort. She instantly shifted into the ruthless, methodical attorney mode that made her so terrifying in a courtroom. "Listen to me very carefully, Skyla," she said, her voice sharp and authoritative. "Do not delete a single message. Take a screenshot of the texts right now and email them to a secure server. Take a picture of your vehicle's license plate and VIN number. Export your location history from your phone for the past 5 years and save it." I took a shaky breath. "You think they stole my identity?" "I think your father just realized you have assets," Tessa replied coldly. "People who commit financial crimes against their own children only panic when they realize the child has enough resources to hire a forensic accountant. If you go to that house tonight, you do not drink anything they hand you, you do not touch a single pen, and most importantly, Arizona is a one-party consent state. You download a voice recording application, you turn it on before you walk through their front door, and you let it run." I hung up the phone. I stood in the quiet luxury of the restroom, staring at the marble veins on the wall, letting the reality of the situation settle over me like a heavy, suffocating blanket. My family had not forgotten my birthday. They had deliberately stayed silent because they were sitting on a ticking time bomb, and they did not want to trigger my suspicion before they figured out how to defuse it. I survived the business dinner. I smiled. I negotiated. I secured the margins for Solstice Vector Mobility, but my mind was already preparing for a different kind of war. Hours later, the negotiation concluded successfully. I walked back out to the valet stand. The night air had cooled significantly, carrying a chill that seeped through my blazer. The attendant brought my vehicle around, the sleek black exterior gleaming under the harsh artificial lights of the hotel driveway. Before I opened the heavy door, I paused. I looked at my own reflection in the dark. Tinted glass of the driver's side window. I saw a woman in a powerful suit, standing next to a machine that represented absolute independence. I finally understood the look on my father's face. Victor Flores was not horrified because I had become successful. He was not intimidated by my wealth. He was paralyzed with absolute terror because he realized I had become strong enough, smart enough, and legally capable enough to completely destroy whatever dark, fraudulent secret he was desperately trying to hide. I pulled up to the single-story stucco house in Gilbert shortly after 9 o'clock in the evening. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of suburban development where the homeowners associations dictate the exact shade of beige allowed on the exterior walls. My parents' house looked exactly as it had for the last 2 decades. The lawn was manicured to a violent degree, the bushes trimmed into unnatural geometric shapes. Before I unbuckled my seatbelt, I pulled out my phone, opened the voice memo application, and pressed the bright red record button. I locked the screen, slipped the phone into the deep pocket of my trousers, and walked up the driveway. When I pushed the front door open, the familiar suffocating scent of synthetic lavender air freshener and lemon polish hit the back of my throat. The house was immaculate. Denise maintained the living room like a museum exhibit, where every throw pillow was karate chopped down the middle and every magazine on the glass coffee table was fanned out at precise, equidistant angles. The oppressive cleanliness of the space had always been a psychological shield for her, as if a spotless carpet could somehow sanitize the toxic reality living inside the walls. They were waiting for me in the dining room. I walked through the arched doorway and immediately noticed the centerpiece on the dark oak table. It was a rectangular sheet cake, still sitting inside its cheap, clear plastic supermarket container. The frosting was a violent, artificial blue, and the words, "Happy Birthday," were piped across the top in a hurried, lopsided red scrawl. It was the kind of $15 cake you grab from the clearance rack on your way home from a gas station. Denise stood near the kitchen counter, wringing a dish towel between her hands. She forced a bright, brittle smile that did not even come close to reaching her eyes. "I was planning a late surprise for you to make up for Tuesday," she said. Her voice pitched half an octave higher than normal. "We wanted to do something special. Just the family." I looked at the plastic container. I looked at the unlit, solitary candle thrown carelessly onto the table next to it. It was an insulting piece of stagecraft. They had not bought this cake to celebrate me. They had purchased it as a prop, a cheap emotional bribe designed to lower my defenses before they sprang the trap. "Thank you," I said, my voice flat, giving them absolutely nothing to work with. I pulled out a heavy wooden chair and sat down, keeping my posture rigid. Victor was seated at the head of the table. He was wearing a freshly pressed polo shirt, trying to project the relaxed authority of a patriarch holding court, but I could see the subtle tells of his anxiety. His jaw muscle was twitching, and his fingers drummed a frantic, silent rhythm against his thigh. He cleared his throat and leaned forward, attempting to mask his desperation with a thick layer of fabricated paternal interest. "So, Skyla," Victor began, utilizing a tone of warm curiosity that I had not heard directed at me since I was in middle school. "How are things at the electric vehicle company? Solstice, right? You must be moving up the ladder. That car I saw you with the other night, the Tesla, do they issue those to upper management now? Or did you hit some kind of massive retention bonus?" I kept my hands folded quietly in my lap. He was fishing. He was conducting a real-time audit of my liquidity. "I am doing well," I replied smoothly, offering no specific figures. He chuckled, but it sounded like dry leaves scraping across concrete. "Well, you must be pulling in a serious salary to maintain a vehicle like that. Are you looking to buy a house soon? Maybe a nice $400,000 place in Scottsdale? You have the credit for it, I am sure." It was too much. It was an avalanche of financial inquiries from a man who had not asked if I was alive or dead for an entire year. Before I could formulate a deflective answer, Roman shifted uncomfortably in the chair across from me. He looked terrible. There were dark, bruised bags under his eyes, and his usually perfectly styled hair was unkempt. Roman leaned his elbows on the table and let out a heavy, dramatic sigh. "It is a meat grinder out there right now, Skyla. The market is just brutal. The banks are suffocating small businesses, cutting credit lines without any warning. Sometimes, you're just trying to keep your head above water, and you run into some paperwork hiccups, you know?" He was paving the road. He was speaking in broad, generalized terms about the economy, trying to dilute whatever specific, localized fraud they had committed into a universal struggle. He wanted me to agree that the system was unfair, so that when they finally confessed, it would look like an administrative snag rather than a felony. Victor decided it was time to close the trap. He reached down beside his chair and lifted a thick manila folder onto the table. He did not hand it to me. He placed his palm flat against the cardboard and slowly slid it across the polished wood until it stopped directly in front of my hands. "Speaking of paperwork," Victor said, his voice dropping an octave, trying to sound casual but failing entirely. "We actually have a tiny favor to ask. It is just a basic confirmation document to correct an old file. The bank is doing a standard internal audit, and we just need your signature right here on the bottom line tonight, just to avoid any unnecessary trouble for the family." I did not reach for the folder. I did not even break eye contact with my father. I sat perfectly still in the stifling, lavender-scented air. "Which old file?" I asked. The question was 3 words long, but it landed on the dining table like a cinder block. The entire room went dead silent for exactly 1/2 of a beat. It was a microscopic pause, but it was all the confirmation I needed. In that fraction of a second, Victor and Roman exchanged a panicked, fleeting glance. They had entirely miscalculated. They had expected the old Skyla, the compliant daughter who would blindly sign whatever they put in front of her just to earn a crumb of their approval and escape the tension. They did not expect me to be awake. Sensing the tactical failure, Denise immediately abandoned the friendly mother routine and went straight for the emotional jugular. She stepped forward, her face twisting into a mask of wounded martyrdom. "After everything we have sacrificed for you," Denise hissed, her voice trembling with weaponized guilt. "Do you have any idea what it took to raise you? We let you live in this house rent-free for 8 whole months after you graduated college. We bought your groceries. We delayed our own retirement comfort so you could have a head start in life. And you are going to sit there and interrogate your father over a simple signature to help your own brother?" She was attempting an alchemy of manipulation, trying to convert vague maternal obligations from my early 20s into a binding legal liability in my 30s. Victor held up a hand, silencing Denise. He played the role of the rational mediator, the calm center of the storm. "It is just a formality. Skyla, it is for Copper Ridge Habitat Group, Roman's home renovation business. There is an old guarantee attached to one of the vendor accounts, and the lender just needs someone to reconfirm the status because of a system migration. If you just sign the acknowledgement page, we can cut the cake and you can go home." He said the words so smoothly, but his eyes were wide, fixed on my hands. He was sweating. I finally moved. I reached out and rested my fingertips on the edge of the manila folder. I opened the cardboard cover and flipped past the standard legal boilerplate, my eyes scanning the dense, tightly spaced paragraphs. I turned to the second page, then the third, searching for the core of the document. I found the signature block, and my blood turned into ice water. There, printed in stark black ink under the heading of a commercial credit agreement, was the word guarantor. Right next to that terrifying legal classification was my full legal name, Skyla Flores. But that was not the detail that made the breath catch in my throat. Hovering directly above the printed line was a digital signature stamp. It was an electronic DocuSign verification, complete with a timestamp and an alphanumeric code. The cursive font simulated my handwriting perfectly. It was the exact style of electronic signature I had used to secure the lease on my very first apartment years ago. I stared at the blue ink on the white paper. I had never seen this document before in my life. I had never authorized this debt. I had never agreed to back Roman's failing business. My family had not invited me over to correct a paperwork error. They had invited me over to trick me into legally ratifying a massive, fraudulent debt that they had already forged my name 2 years ago. I did not throw the folder across the room. I did not slam my fists against the dark oak table. I did not raise my voice or demand an immediate confession. Anger is a volatile, unpredictable emotion, and I needed absolute clarity for what I was looking at. Instead of reacting like a betrayed daughter, I reacted exactly like a senior pricing strategist who had just found a multi-million-dollar discrepancy in a complex vendor contract. I flattened the thick stack of paper against the wood surface, smoothed out the creases with the palm of my hand, and began to read. I read every single line. I read the subheadings, the defined terms, the boilerplate indemnification clauses, and the microscopic footnotes at the bottom of the margins. The silence in the dining room stretched out, becoming thick and unbearable. For 4 full minutes, the only sound was the harsh, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the dry scrape of paper as I slowly turned the pages. Victor shifted his weight heavily in his chair. He cleared his throat twice. He was a man accustomed to bullying people into quick, unread signatures through sheer intimidation. My slow, methodical, terrifying silence was completely short-circuiting his entire strategy. When I reached page 3, the true nature of the trap revealed itself in stark, undeniable clarity. The document was not a new application for a line of credit. At the very top, printed in bold, capitalized letters, it read, "Ratification and Acknowledgement of Commercial Guarantee." My mind processed the legal terminology with blinding speed. A ratification document does not create a new liability. It legally binds you to an existing one. It is a retroactive shield for the lender. They were not asking me to help them start a new loan. They were trying to force me to legalize a fraudulent debt they had already established under my name in the past. I flipped to the attached exhibits. the historical data the bank had seemingly requested to be updated. Here, the absolute sloppiness of their crime was laid bare in black ink. There was an email address listed under the primary contact information for the guarantor. It read, skyla.flores.official at a generic mail provider. I had never owned or operated that address. I had possessed the exact same professional email for the last 10 years. Beneath that false email, in a section dedicated to electronic signature security protocols, was a log for a two-step verification process. A text message containing a 6-digit authorization code had been sent to a specific phone number to finalize the original electronic signature. I stared at the 10 digits printed on the page. It was not my current cellular number. It was not my previous cellular number. It was a secondary family line that Denise used to manage for our shared household plan years ago. She had controlled the billing. She had held the physical device. I looked up, meeting Victor's eyes. I did not accuse him of forgery. I simply tapped my index finger against the fraudulent email address. I do not recognize this contact information, I stated, my voice completely devoid of inflection. And this is a ratification. You are asking me to swear, under penalty of perjury, that I have actively managed this account. I have not. Victor waved his hand dismissively, though a visible bead of sweat was forming near his left temple. You agreed to all of this over the phone a few years ago. Skyla, you probably just forgot. We set up a separate email so your personal inbox would not get flooded with corporate spam. It was a favor to you. We were protecting your privacy. The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking, but he did not stop there. Sensing that his paternal charm and gaslighting had failed to produce a signature, he immediately pivoted to a veiled threat. Look, the bank is doing a massive internal audit, Victor said, leaning forward, his voice hardening into a low, aggressive rumble. If you do not sign this acknowledgement tonight and clear up their system error, they are going to escalate it. They will freeze assets. They will file a civil suit. They could absolutely destroy your credit score. We are talking a drop of 100 to 200 points in a matter of days. You do not want that kind of litigation attached to your name, especially with your fancy corporate job. Just sign the paper and we make it go away. The way he delivered that sequence of consequences was far too fluid. He did not sound like a man making an educated guess about banking procedures. He sounded like a man who had already spoken to a collections officer. He was describing a bomb that had already been armed, and he was trying to hand me the detonator. Roman, who had been staring at his shoes for the last 10 minutes, suddenly spoke up. His voice was thin, reedy, and vibrating with suppressed panic. We just need more time. Skyla, that is all it is. The business is solid. We just need 90 more days to cycle the accounts receivable. If you do not sign, they pull the plug on everything. Roman's pathetic plea was the final piece of the puzzle. You do not beg for 90 extra days on a healthy account. You beg for 90 days when the lender is preparing to send the sheriff to lock the doors and seize the equipment. The debt was not just fraudulent. It was deeply terminally toxic. I knew that if I confronted them with the word fraud right then and there, they would physically prevent me from leaving the house with the document. I needed the evidence. I needed the paper trail. So, I employed the most effective negotiation tactic I knew. I played the role of the confused, overwhelmed, compliant daughter. I let my shoulders slump a fraction of an inch. I let a look of overwhelming hesitation cross my face. I am just so tired, I whispered, rubbing my temples with my free hand. I do not remember a phone call. I do not remember any of this. I need to read this when I'm not exhausted. I will take it home, review it in the morning, and we can figure it out. Victor slammed his open palm against the table, the sharp crack echoing violently in the dining room. No, you need to sign it right now. The deadline is tomorrow morning. We cannot wait. His sudden, explosive urgency was the ultimate psychological confirmation. A routine paperwork correction does not expire at dawn. They were completely out of time. The bank was coming, and I was their only human shield. I stood up, gripping the manila folder tightly against my chest. I do not sign legal contracts at 10 o'clock at night, I said firmly, taking a step backward toward the hallway. I will look at it tomorrow. Denise started to cry. A performative, gasping sob designed to make me feel like a monster, but I was already turning away. I walked briskly out of the dining room and into the adjoining kitchen, desperate to reach the front door and the safety of the night air. As I passed the marble kitchen island, my eyes caught a flash of bright red ink. Sitting next to a ceramic fruit bowl was a haphazard stack of mail. On the very top was a thick, legal-sized envelope that had been hastily ripped open. The return address, printed in the upper left corner, featured the imposing, stylized logo of a major commercial lending institution, but it was the destination address that made my heart stop completely. The envelope had been mailed to my parents' house in Gilbert, but the name printed clearly on the recipient line was Skyla Flores. They had been intercepting my financial mail. I walked out the front door. The unlit birthday cake, and my family's desperate lies left behind in the sterile, lavender-scented air. At exactly 8 o'clock the following morning, the Arizona sun was already baking the glass exterior of Tessa Monroe's law firm in downtown Phoenix. I sat in a high-backed leather chair inside her expansive corner office, the manila folder from the previous night resting like a dormant explosive device on the polished mahogany desk. Across from me sat Miles Carver. Miles was not an attorney. He was a highly sought-after private credit specialist, a forensic ghost who spent his entire professional life dissecting complex commercial liabilities and hunting down phantom assets. He possessed the tired, meticulous eyes of a man who read uniform commercial code filings for recreation. Tessa poured 3 cups of black coffee from a French press. Nobody spoke of the weather, the traffic, or the trivialities of the morning. We were operating entirely in the sterile, unfeeling environment of a financial autopsy. Miles connected his heavily encrypted laptop to the large wall monitor and began pulling my master credit reports from all 3 major bureaus, aggressively cross-referencing them against state-level corporate registries and commercial lien databases. For the first 20 minutes, the heavy silence in the room was only broken by the rapid percussive clicking of his keyboard. Then, he stopped entirely. He leaned back in his chair and let out a low, slow exhale that sent a distinct, paralyzing chill crawling straight up my spine. "I found the origin point," Miles stated, his voice completely devoid of inflection. He tapped a final key, and a dense, digitized ledger flooded the large screen. "You have a massive commercial guarantee hanging directly over your head, legally attached to Copper Ridge Habitat Group. The principal amount they leveraged against your name is absolutely staggering, but that is not the most alarming part. Look at the date of execution." I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the heavily redacted lines of data until I found the activation timestamp. The digital ink stated the liability had been officially initiated almost 4 years ago. My stomach completely dropped out from under me. The air in the climate-controlled office suddenly felt entirely too thin to breathe. I did not just recognize the year, I recognized the exact month. Almost 4 years ago was the precise moment I had finally gathered the courage to sever all communication with my parents and Roman. It was the immediate aftermath of a massive, explosive argument over their relentless demands for me to co-sign a high-interest commercial auto loan for my brother's failing fleet. I had refused, packed my remaining belongings, walked out of their house, and changed my locks. I had thought I was walking away toward freedom. I did not realize that the moment I walked out the door and established my boundaries, they simply found a back door to use my assets without my permission. I was no longer treated as a human being or a daughter. I was simply an unattended financial asset left unguarded. Miles zoomed in on the authentication logs provided in the deep background check, magnifying the text for us to read. The system records confirmed exactly what I had suspected while sitting at their dining table. The entire financial instrument had been verified and locked in using that fabricated email address. Furthermore, the 2-step authentication bypass required by the lending institution had been routed directly to a secondary phone number. "I know that number," I whispered, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. It was a spare line bundled into our old family cellular plan. And who was the primary account holder for that specific plan? Tessa asked, her pen hovering over a legal pad. Denise, I replied. My mother managed the billing. She held the physical device. My mother had physically held the phone that received the 6-digit security code. She had read the text message, typed the numbers into the prompt, and effectively signed my financial life away while sitting comfortably in her pristine, lavender-scented living room. It gets substantially worse, Miles continued, his fingers flying across the trackpad to pull up a different investigative database. I am looking at the delinquency history for the vendor account. This loan did not just suddenly go sour last week due to a market fluctuation. It has been actively bleeding out for the better part of 14 months. And every single missed payment notification, every escalating warning letter, every threat of default was mailed directly to the physical address in Gilbert. I stared at the screen, a new, violently cold layer of nausea washing over me. For over a year, physical envelopes bearing the imposing logo of a commercial lender had been arriving at my parents' house, explicitly stamped with my legal name. The open envelope I had spotted on the kitchen counter was not an anomaly. It was the tail end of an avalanche. Someone, undoubtedly Denise, had been systematically intercepting my mail. She had been ripping those letters open, reading the escalating legal threats, and quietly throwing them into the garbage disposal. They had stood by and watched a financial wildfire race directly toward me, and instead of warning me, they had simply closed the blinds to hide the smoke. But why call the meeting now? I asked, my voice trembling with a mixture of rage and confusion. If they have been successfully hiding this disaster for over a year, why the sudden disorganized panic? Why the desperate push to force a ratification signature out of me last night? Miles pulled up a final document, a scanned copy of a severe legal notice filed deep within the state database. Because of this, Skyla, the document displayed on the monitor was a formal notice of acceleration. In the commercial lending world, it is the ultimate death sentence. It signifies that the bank is no longer asking for past due monthly payments. They are aggressively demanding the entire principal balance immediately, and if it is not paid, they will initiate the legal process to seize any and all attached assets. I looked at the automated issue date stamped at the top right corner of the notice. It took my brain a few agonizing seconds to process the sequence of numbers. When the realization finally hit, it felt like someone had driven a physical wedge straight into my ribs, shattering my ability to inhale. The notice of acceleration had been generated, finalized, and electronically dispatched on the exact morning of my 33rd birthday. The puzzle pieces snapped together with a sickening, terrifying logic. The pain of the previous days transformed instantly. My mother had not forgotten my birthday. She had not simply been too busy, too self-absorbed, or too careless to send a text message. When she woke up that morning, she had likely checked that fabricated email account or opened the physical mail and seen the final, catastrophic warning from the bank. She knew the explosion was no longer theoretical. It was imminent. She intentionally, maliciously ignored my birthday to buy time. If she had called me to say happy birthday, if we had engaged in any normal conversation, I might have heard the panic vibrating in her voice. I might have asked the wrong question about how Roman was doing. She needed absolute, total silence to stretch the clock for just a few more hours. That silence allowed Victor and Roman enough time to hastily orchestrate the fake family dinner, buy the cheap supermarket cake to lower my defenses, and print out the ratification papers. They needed me completely off guard, feeling isolated and unloved, so I would be desperate enough to sign anything just to mend the bridge. Tessa, who had been listening intently with her hands steepled under her chin, finally spoke. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the fog of my realization. "Do you see the architecture of this betrayal, Skyla?" Tessa asked, pointing the tip of her pen at the monitor. "The trap did not begin when your father slid that folder across the dining table last night. It did not even begin when he panicked at the hotel valet upon seeing your car. This started years ago. Someone in your house made a cold, calculated decision to turn your pristine identity into a financial bulletproof vest, solely so they could survive the fallout of their own inevitable failures. As Tessa spoke those words, a dormant memory from my college years clawed its way to the surface of my mind, painfully sharp and vivid. I was a sophomore, buried under a mountain of textbooks and scholarship applications. Denise had walked into my bedroom, holding a printed sheet of paper. She had been hyper-organized back then, obsessed with managing every administrative detail of our lives. She told me my personal email address was entirely too informal for the corporate world. She said she had taken the liberty of creating a new, highly professional account for me to use exclusively for important university documents, background checks, and grant applications. I will hold on to the master password, just in case you ever get locked out and need something urgently, Denise had said, her voice dripping with artificial maternal concern. At the time, I had not cared. I was tired, stressed, and perfectly willing to let her manage the administrative noise. I had completely forgotten about that specific inbox within a week. I had handed her the master key to my digital identity without a second thought, foolishly believing it was an act of a mother looking out for her child's future. The betrayal was so profound, so meticulously structured over the span of a decade, that it bypassed standard anger entirely and settled into a state of cold, clinical horror. They had weaponized my own trust. They had weaponized my desire to be independent. Every time I succeeded, every time I built something solid and valuable for myself, they had secretly tethered their sinking ship to my foundation, completely prepared to drag me down to the bottom the moment they took on too much water. I looked away from the glowing monitor and stared out the large glass window at the sprawling, sun-drenched city below. The mechanical logic of the investigation had perfectly merged with the deepest personal agony I had ever experienced in my adult life. The heavy silence on my birthday was not an absence of love. It was a tactical maneuver in a financial war I did not even know I was fighting. I realized, with absolute, crushing clarity, the true nature of the events. My family had not completely ignored my 33rd year of life. They had prepared something for me after all. The only birthday present they had carefully arranged, wrapped, and delivered was a massive, fraudulent commercial debt that they desperately needed me to legalize before it destroyed them. I abandoned the concept of a chaotic, emotional confrontation the moment I walked out of Tessa's office. Screaming matches were the preferred currency of my father. Victor thrived in environments where logic was drowned out by volume, where he could bully his way through a dispute by sheer force of personality. I was not going to play his game. I was a senior pricing strategist. My entire professional existence relied on the absolute, unyielding truth of mathematics, chronological sequencing, and forensic auditing. If my family wanted to use legal contracts to destroy me, I would simply use the exact same language to bury them. I turned to the private credit specialist sitting across from Tessa. "Miles," I instructed, my voice flat and completely devoid of warmth. "I do not want just the final document outputs. I need you to initiate a deep data extraction. I want the back-end metadata for the entire electronic signature packet." Miles typed rapidly, his eyes scanning a new terminal window. "You want the digital fingerprints?" "Exactly," I confirmed. "I need the Internet protocol addresses for every single login associated with that fabricated inbox. I want the unique device identification numbers used to access the portal. I need the exact server timestamp detailing the minute that email account was registered. Most importantly, I need the cellular carrier routing logs that prove precisely when and where the two-step verification code pinged my mother's secondary phone line. If the Internet protocol address matches the router in my father's house or my brother's office, we stop dealing in theories and start dealing in federal wire fraud." Tessa, meanwhile, was structuring the ultimate countermeasure. Her fingers flew across her keyboard as she drafted a formal identity theft affidavit. It was a severe, uncompromising federal document. The moment I signed it and submitted it to the lending institution, it would act as a legal firewall, instantly freezing all civil collection actions against me and forcing the bank to launch a criminal investigation into the true signatories. But as she finished aligning the final signature block, Tessa closed her laptop with a sharp snap. "Do not file this today, Skyla," she advised, her tone shifting from lawyer to tactical advisor. "If we deploy the affidavit right now, the bank notifies them immediately. Victor will hire a defense attorney, Roman will suddenly lose his memory, and Denise will destroy her phone. They will close ranks. We need to keep them comfortable for just 24 more hours. You need to play the role of the overwhelmed, hesitant daughter. We need them to feel confident enough to talk on the record." I agreed. I left the law firm and drove straight to the Solstice Vector Mobility corporate campus. I bypassed my morning departmental meetings, locked the heavy glass door to my corner office, and began utilizing my own corporate network. Leveraging a discreet professional favor from a senior underwriter I had collaborated with during a recent charging station rollout, I requested a confidential review of an old industrial warehouse lease tied directly to Copper Ridge Habitat Group. When the encrypted dossier arrived in my secure inbox 2 hours later, the true scale of Roman's financial rot became undeniably clear. The financial statements submitted to the commercial landlord were complete works of fiction. To secure a massive operating space he could never legitimately afford. My brother had utilized grossly inflated quarterly revenue forecasts and entirely fabricated profit and loss statements. But as I scrolled through the secondary collateral schedules attached to the property lease, a new, entirely separate nightmare materialized on my high-resolution monitor. The fraudulent activity was not contained to a single commercial credit line. Buried deep within the vendor agreements was a high-yield, aggressive lease contract for heavy construction equipment. We were talking about industrial excavators, heavy-duty skid steers, and commercial loaders. The total principal value was astronomical. And sitting quietly on page 14, listed explicitly as the secondary, unconditional guarantor, was my name. According to the default ledger, the equipment contract had imploded 6 months prior. The machinery had likely been repossessed by the dealer, leaving behind a massive, toxic deficiency balance that the creditors were now aggressively trying to collect. I printed every single page and laid them out across the smooth surface of my desk. The anatomy of their crime was perfectly, sickeningly uniform. Every fraudulent contract, every inflated lease, and every toxic debt instrument pointed backward to the exact same clustered digital footprint: the engineered email address, the physical mailing address in Gilbert, the secondary phone line paid for by Denise, and that perfectly simulated electronic signature, lifted directly from the digital template I had naively used to rent my very first post-college apartment. Standing alone in my office, looking down at the absolute devastation they had orchestrated, the final piece of Victor's psychology clicked firmly into place. I replayed that bizarre encounter outside the hotel valet in my mind. My father did not panic because my $95,000 vehicle bruised his fragile ego. He did not care about the aesthetics of my corporate success. He panicked because the vehicle fundamentally changed my legal classification. For years, I had been a highly useful phantom to them. I was a pristine credit score attached to a daughter who lived quietly, with no significant, visible property to seize. But the moment Victor saw that car, he realized I possessed genuine, verifiable, and highly attachable assets. If the bank accelerated the defaulted loans, pierced the corporate veil, and came collecting, they would not stop at his failing business. The creditors would immediately target my salary, my bank accounts, and my property. And far more terrifyingly for him, my newfound wealth meant I finally had the financial endurance to hire relentless corporate attorneys to trace the fraud straight back to his front door. He was not intimidated by my money. He was terrified of my ammunition. I picked up my cellular phone. I needed them to feel completely in control. I opened my message thread with Denise and carefully crafted a response, systematically stripping away every ounce of the cold, lethal anger simmering in my veins. I deployed the soft, pliant, desperate tone of a daughter who simply needed her parents to guide her through a scary situation. "I want to help the family," I typed, forcing my fingers to hit the keys. "But I am just really confused by all these dense pages. I need everyone to sit down and explain the timeline to me fully so I know exactly what I'm signing. Can we meet again tomorrow evening? The response illuminated my screen in less than 3 minutes. Denise took the bait with a speed that bordered on pathetic. Of course, sweetheart, she replied. Whatever you need. We will explain everything so you feel comfortable. See you tomorrow. Love you. I did not reply to the hollow declaration of love. Instead, I immediately opened a web browser and navigated to the corporate portal for Harbor 9 Suites. Harbor 9 was a premium, executive co-working facility located in the heart of the financial district. I reserved their premier glass-walled boardroom for 8 o'clock the following night. I did not choose this specific venue for its modern aesthetics or its complimentary sparkling water. I chose Harbor 9 Suites because it operated under a rigid, uncompromising security infrastructure. The entire facility was heavily monitored. There were high-definition security cameras recording every single angle of the corridors, the elevator banks, and the main reception area, ensuring an undeniable, time-stamped visual record of exactly who entered the building. The front desk required mandatory government identification logging for all guests. Most importantly, the facility offered a licensed, on-demand corporate notary public who could verify and stamp legal signatures right at the table. My parents and my brother believed they were walking into a quiet room to finally secure their fraudulent salvation and bind me to their sinking ship forever. They had absolutely no idea that I had just finished constructing the perfect, inescapable theater for their execution. I sent the text message proposing Harbor 9 Suites early that morning, framing it as a desire for efficiency. I told Victor I wanted to handle the documents in a professional environment, get the forms notarized cleanly, and be done with the entire situation. He eagerly agreed, interpreting my request for a corporate space as a sign of surrender. He thought I was simply formalizing my submission. When I arrived at the reserved glass-walled boardroom at 7:30 in the evening, I placed my phone face up on the polished slate table. The voice recording application was already running. The screen dimmed to black. Next to it, I set down a stack of completely blank white paper and a single, heavy metallic pen. Nothing else. The manila folder containing their fraudulent demands remained locked inside my briefcase. They arrived 20 minutes early. Through the transparent glass walls of the corridor, I watched them approach. They were not dressed for a casual family reconciliation. Victor wore a sharply tailored navy suit, the kind he only pulled out for high-stakes depositions or bank negotiations. Roman was squeezed into a rigid gray blazer, his posture stiff and defensive. Denise wore a high-collared silk blouse, clutching her designer handbag like a physical shield. They looked exactly like 3 desperate debtors walking into an audit. Their attire alone stripped away the illusion of a simple familial misunderstanding. Victor opened the heavy glass door and stepped inside, projecting an aura of artificial confidence. He surveyed the modern, sterile room, nodding in approval before taking the chair directly across from me. Roman and Denise flanked him, moving with the synchronized caution of a legal defense team. Victor looked down at the blank paper, his brow furrowing slightly. He reached into his leather portfolio and pulled out the ratification document, sliding it toward the center of the table. "It is good to see you being practical about this, Skyla," Victor began, his tone dripping with practiced corporate warmth. "A neutral location is smart. Let us just get your signature on the bottom line, get the notary in here, and we can all move past this little hurdle." I did not touch the document. I picked up the metallic pen and tapped it once against the blank paper. "I will sign it," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "But only after I understand exactly what I'm signing. I need the complete timeline. From the beginning, no skip details, no vague summaries. Tell me exactly how my name ended up on a commercial guarantee for Copper Ridge Habitat Group." Victor let out a harsh, impatient breath. The mask of the benevolent patriarch began to slip, revealing the cornered animal underneath. "We went over this yesterday. It is just an old file." "That is a summary," I countered, my eyes locking onto his. "I want the timeline." He leaned forward, pressing his forearms against the table. The polite facade evaporated entirely. Fine. You want the truth? Several years ago, Roman needed a massive influx of capital to secure materials for a new development contract. His credit score was barely hovering around 500. The banks laughed him out of the lobby. If he did not get that funding, the company was going to fold within 30 days. We used your name on a few specific applications because your credit was pristine. Family has to save each other. Skyla, that is how the real world works. We took a calculated risk to keep your brother afloat. He said it with such terrifying conviction. He truly believed that stealing my identity was an act of noble familial sacrifice. Denise chimed in, leaning over the table with a desperate, pleading expression. We never wanted to stress you out. Sweetheart, you were always working so hard at your new job. I knew that old email account I set up for you in college was still active. I just monitored the inbox and held on to any physical letters that came to the house so you would not panic. I was reading your mail to protect you from the anxiety. I let her words hang in the silent, air-conditioned room. She had just verbally confessed, on tape, to intercepting my legal correspondence and tampering with a communications channel attached to a financial instrument. So you hid the warning letters, I said, my voice dangerously calm. Roman shifted violently in his chair, the pressure clearly breaking his fragile composure. He slammed his hand down on the armrest. Because we had it under control. We just needed to move some capital from another project. If you had just been cooperative from the start, or if we knew you were going to be this stubborn, we would not have had to shuffle the paperwork around so many times just to keep the underwriters off our backs. The room went dead silent. Roman froze, realizing exactly what had just slipped out of his mouth. He had not just admitted to the original forgery, he had just confessed to a continuous, multi-layered campaign of document manipulation. Shuffling paperwork around meant they were actively defrauding the bank on a recurring basis, rolling toxic debt from one entity to another. I adopted a look of deep, overwhelming confusion, playing directly into their assumption that I was struggling to comprehend the mechanics of the situation. I do not understand, I murmured, staring at the blank paper. How did the bank even verify it was me? They require two-step authentication for commercial guarantees. Who clicked the verification code? Who changed the primary phone number on the digital portal? Because my phone never rang, Denise answered far too quickly. It was the old family plan number, the one ending in 4492. The system just automatically sent the text message there, and I typed in the 6 digits on the computer. It was just an automated prompt. Skyla. It did not mean anything. She remembered the exact last 4 digits of the phone number. She remembered the exact length of the security code. A person does not retain that level of granular detail years later unless they were the one physically executing the fraud. My mother had just perfectly described herself committing felony wire fraud. Victor realized they were talking too much. He could sense the control slipping through his fingers, and his response was to immediately escalate to raw intimidation. He reached across the table, grabbed the ratification document, and shoved it aggressively until it hit my hands. Enough about the technicalities, Victor snarled, his face flushing with dark, heavy anger. The past does not matter right now. What matters is that the lender is preparing to drop the hammer. If you do not sign this ratification document tonight, the entire loan officially implodes by tomorrow morning. And let me make this crystal clear for you. They are not going to come after a bankrupt construction company. They are going to see your new corporate title. They are going to see your expensive vehicle. And they are going to plunge their claws directly into your assets. They will come for your name first. Sign the paper. Skyla, do it right now. It was the most naked, unfiltered threat he had ever delivered. He was explicitly holding me hostage with my own stolen identity, demanding I fall on the sword to shield him from the consequences of his own crimes. I did not flinch. I did not pick up the pen. I slowly lifted my head and looked past my father's right shoulder. The boardroom featured a wall of heavy frosted glass that separated us from the main reception corridor. Through the thick, translucent pane, the blurred silhouettes of 2 figures were clearly visible. Sitting quietly in the adjacent waiting area, I knew exactly who they were. One was Tessa, my attorney, armed with the drafted federal affidavit. The other was a man wearing a dark trench coat, holding a thick, encrypted tablet. Victor, Denise, and Roman thought they had cornered me in a private room to force a final surrender. They had no idea that the game had fundamentally changed, and we had just crossed the threshold into a phase where I controlled every single variable. I stood up slowly from the heavy slate table, picking up the blank sheet of paper but leaving the metallic pen untouched. Victor's eyes immediately darted to my hands, his jaw tightening with raw impatience. The sudden movement disrupted his carefully constructed pressure cooker. "Where are you going?" Victor demanded, his voice dropping into that familiar, authoritative register he used whenever he felt his control slipping. "I am going to the main reception desk to print a duplicate copy of this entire ratification packet," I replied smoothly, projecting the aura of a cautious but ultimately compliant daughter. "If I am binding myself to a commercial guarantee of this magnitude, I am keeping a physically stamped copy for my own personal records. I will be back in exactly 2 minutes." Before he could formulate a counter-argument or attempt to block my exit, I turned and walked out the heavy glass door. The moment it clicked shut behind me, the suffocating tension of the boardroom vanished, replaced by the crisp, cool air of the executive corridor. I walked purposefully toward the adjacent waiting area. Tessa stood up from a leather armchair as I approached. Beside her was the man I had seen through the frosted glass. He was tall, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, holding a thick, encrypted digital tablet. He possessed the hard, unblinking gaze of an auditor who spent his life dismantling corporate lies. "Skyla," Tessa said, her voice a low, urgent murmur. "This is Evan Pike. He is the senior internal financial fraud investigator for the commercial lending institution holding the defaulted debt. After we reviewed the preliminary data with Miles this morning, I contacted the bank's executive compliance division. When they realized the potential scale of the identity theft regarding a commercial account, they dispatched Evan immediately. I did not offer a handshake. There was no time for corporate pleasantries. I unlocked my cellular phone, stopped the active voice recording application, and seamlessly transferred the audio file directly to Tessa's secure server. She immediately routed it to Evan's tablet. "They just gave you everything you need," I told Evan, keeping my voice hushed but entirely steady. My mother openly admitted to intercepting my physical mail and verbally confessed to bypassing the 2-step verification security protocols. My brother explicitly acknowledged that they have been continuously shuffling the fraudulent paperwork across multiple channels to avoid detection. It is all on that digital track. Evan inserted a small earpiece, tapped his screen, and listened to the audio file at an accelerated speed. As the recording played, his fingers flew across the keyboard of his tablet, cross-referencing my family's verbal admissions with the deep metadata Miles Carver had extracted earlier that morning. When Evan finally pulled the earpiece out, his expression was completely devoid of sympathy. It was the clinical look of a professional executioner. "The audio confirms the methodology," Evan stated quietly, turning the tablet so Tessa and I could see the cascading lines of data. "But the digital forensics reveal a much darker reality about the execution. I just ran a trace on the unique media access control address belonging to the device that stamped the original forged electronic signature." He pointed to a string of alphanumeric characters highlighted in bright red on his screen. "That digital signature was not executed on a random laptop in your parents' living room during a moment of desperate panic," Evan explained, his words landing like physical blows. "That specific hardware device has been actively communicating with our banking servers for 3 years. It is the exact same machine used to log into the vendor payment portals for Copper Ridge Habitat Group. Furthermore, the static Internet Protocol address attached to the fraudulent signature routes directly back to the commercial network installed at your brother's construction office." My breath caught in my throat as the sheer, terrifying scope of the betrayal crystallized. This was not an impulsive, misguided mistake made by a father trying to save his son on a Tuesday night. It was a highly organized, repeated, and heavily coordinated logistical operation. They had built a family syndicate. Denise caught the automated security codes at the house on her secondary phone, relayed the digits to Roman or Victor at the commercial office, and they executed the felony wire fraud on company hardware. They had weaponized my identity with the cold efficiency of an assembly line. Suddenly, Tessa's phone vibrated violently against the glass coffee table. She glanced at the screen, answered the call, and put it on speakerphone. Holding the device between the three of us, it was Miles Carver. "I kept digging into the capital deployment," Miles said, his voice crackling slightly through the speaker. "I wanted to know exactly how they managed to keep Roman's failing business afloat for so long using your stolen credit line. I started tracking your father's secondary holding companies. I found a massive anomaly." "Tell me," Tessa ordered. "Almost exactly 4 years ago, during the precise same month that the forged commercial guarantee was activated under Skyla's name, Victor's private holding company successfully executed a massive cash-out refinance on a luxury vacation cabin in the northern mountains," Miles revealed. The pieces snapped together with a sickening, audible click in my mind. The timeline was entirely too perfect to be a coincidence. They had not just stolen my financial identity to save Roman's failing construction business. They had used my pristine credit score to secure a massive influx of capital for Copper Ridge, which completely absorbed the company's immediate toxic debt. By using me as the sacrificial financial sponge, Victor was able to entirely protect his own personal liquidity. He kept his own cash reserves safely hidden, allowing him to easily refinance his luxury vacation property, while I blindly carried the explosive weight of his son's corporate failures. I was not just a shield. I was a direct financial subsidy for their upper-middle-class lifestyle. Looking at the undeniable data glowing on Evan's tablet, the ultimate psychological puzzle regarding the $95,000 Tesla finally resolved itself. When Victor saw that electric vehicle glide into the hotel valet, his sudden panic had absolutely nothing to do with parental jealousy. He knew the fraudulent commercial loan was actively collapsing. He knew the bank was preparing to accelerate the debt and hunt down the guarantor. For years, I had been an invisible target, a woman with a great credit score but no significant, attachable property. But the car changed the entire legal landscape. The vehicle proved I was now a high-net-worth individual. Victor realized two terrifying things simultaneously. First, the bank's asset recovery division would immediately lock onto my visible wealth and tear my life apart to recoup their losses. Second, and far more dangerously for him, my financial success meant I was no longer a helpless victim he could easily manipulate or outspend in a courtroom. I possessed the liquid capital to hire ruthless corporate attorneys, forensic accountants, and private investigators to trace the fraud straight back to his doorstep. He was not afraid of my money. He was terrified that I finally had the ammunition to destroy him. I looked at Tessa, giving her a single, sharp nod. I turned away from the reception area and walked purposefully back down the corridor toward the glass-walled boardroom. When I pushed the heavy door open, Victor was drumming his fingers frantically against the slate table. Roman was actively wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve. Denise was staring blankly at her designer handbag. I sat back down in my chair, sliding the blank sheet of paper aside. I adopted a look of conflicted resignation, playing the role of the exhausted daughter who was finally ready to surrender for the sake of household peace. "All right," I said, letting a heavy sigh escape my lips. "I will sign the ratification document." Victor exhaled a massive, shuddering breath of relief. His posture instantly relaxed, a triumphant, arrogant smirk threatening to break across his face. "But," I added, holding up my hand to stop him from sliding the folder closer, "since there has been so much confusion tonight about old files, timelines, and paperwork shuffling, I want to do this completely by the book. I do not want the bank coming back next week, claiming there was another administrative error. Harbor 9 Suites has a licensed, bonded corporate notary public on staff right now. If you truly did nothing wrong, and this is just a simple, harmless administrative cleanup to help Roman, then we will execute the signature right now, directly in front of an official legal witness, and get it formally stamped for the bank." Victor hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes narrowing slightly, but the desperation completely overrode his survival instincts. He needed my signature to stop the bank from destroying him in the morning. He believed that once the ink was dry, the method of verification would not matter. Absolutely, Victor agreed eagerly, tapping the manila folder. That is a very smart professional way to handle it. Skyla, let us bring them in and finish this tonight. I reached forward and pressed the silver intercom button built into the center of the conference table. Less than 30 seconds later, the heavy glass door swung open. The facility receptionist stepped into the room, followed closely by a woman wearing a professional blazer, carrying a heavy leather logbook and a brass notary stamp. Victor smiled warmly at the notary, completely oblivious to the reality of the situation. He thought he had successfully cornered his prey. He believed he had won. He had absolutely no idea that the very next person scheduled to walk through that open glass door was going to shatter his entire reality into 1,000 unrecoverable pieces. The notary, a woman with a brass name tag pinned to a gray cardigan, took her assigned seat at the end of the heavy slate table. She opened a thick, leather-bound journal, smoothing the crisp pages down with the flat of her palm. She unzipped a small pouch, placing a heavy brass stamp and a high-quality ink pen next to her logbook. Victor immediately seized the opportunity. He leaned across the table, sliding the thick manila folder directly into my hands, his eyes wide with a frantic, manufactured warmth. "All right," Victor said, his voice dripping with forced casualness, trying to project the image of a reasonable father wrapping up a minor household chore. "Just sign right there on page 4. It is just a routine cleanup procedure, a standard administrative fix so the bank does not make a mountain out of a molehill. The notary will stamp it, and we can all go home and put this completely behind us. Let us get this over with." I did not reach for the pen. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap. I looked past my father and directed my attention entirely to the notary, adopting an expression of polite, mild confusion. "Excuse me," I said softly, my voice carrying clearly across the sterile, silent air of the boardroom. "I have a procedural question before we begin. Can a notary legally witness and stamp a ratification document if the signer is stating, unequivocally and on the official record, that they never actually signed the original underlying contract in the first place?" The air in the room turned instantly to concrete. The notary froze. Her hand hovered inches above her logbook, the pen suddenly motionless. She looked up, her brow furrowing in deep professional alarm. "I am sorry? Are you stating that you did not sign the original commercial guarantee?" Victor's face drained of color in a matter of seconds. "She is just confused," he barked, his voice rising sharply, the polished corporate facade cracking down the middle. "It is an old file from several years ago. She forgot. Do not listen to her. She is just having a temporary memory lapse about the paperwork." Denise lunged forward, her hands fluttering in a desperate, chaotic attempt to regain control of the narrative. She forced a bright, terrifying smile. "Oh, please, it is just family business." She laughed, a shrill, hysterical sound that echoed terribly against the thick glass walls. "Every family does this. We all use each other's information for convenience sometimes, right? It is not a big deal. We share passwords, we share addresses, we share credit profiles when things get tight. It is just what families do to survive." It was a staggering, horrifying statement. Denise was openly, eagerly attempting to normalize felony identity theft in front of a licensed state official, completely blind to the legal reality of her words. She truly believed that blood relation acted as a universal shield against federal law. The notary slowly pulled her journal back toward her chest, her expression hardening into a mask of pure institutional caution. "Ma'am, using someone else's legal information without explicit consent is not a convenience. That is a criminal offense." That single word, criminal, shattered whatever fragile, cowardly resolve Roman had left. My brother, who had been sweating profusely in his rigid gray blazer, completely broke under the pressure. "I told you this was a terrible idea," Roman shouted, his voice cracking violently as he jumped up from his chair. pointing a shaking finger directly at Victor. "I told you we should not have pushed her tonight." This was all his idea. He was the one who said her credit score could carry the commercial lease. I just needed capital to keep the crew working. But he set up the phantom accounts, and Mom kept the emails. Mom hid the mail in the kitchen drawer. "Do not put this entirely on me." They were tearing each other apart. The synchronized defense they had rehearsed had entirely collapsed the moment a neutral legal authority questioned their premise. They were throwing each other under the bus, right in front of a stranger, prioritizing their own survival over the family unit they claimed to protect. Victor slammed his fist onto the table, the sound exploding like a gunshot. "Shut your mouth, Roman!" At that exact moment, the heavy glass door swung open. The shouting ceased instantly. Everyone turned. Evan Pike stepped into the boardroom. He did not look like a man arriving for a friendly corporate negotiation. He wore his dark trench coat, his encrypted tablet held firmly under his left arm. His presence immediately sucked the remaining oxygen out of the space. "Nobody is leaving this room until the record is fully documented," Evan stated. His voice was not loud, but it carried the absolute unyielding authority of a man who possessed the power to freeze bank accounts and initiate federal indictments. He walked slowly toward the table, his eyes locked entirely on my father. "My name is Evan Pike. I am the senior internal financial fraud investigator for the commercial lending institution currently holding the defaulted debt on Copper Ridge Habitat Group." Victor stood up so fast, his heavy leather chair crashed backward into the frosted glass wall. The veins in his neck bulged against his collar, his face flushing a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. "Who the hell invited you?" Victor roared, losing every last ounce of his polished restraint. "This is a private, closed-door family meeting. You have absolutely no jurisdiction here. Get out of this room immediately." I looked up at him. For the first time in my entire life, I did not shrink away from his anger. I did not lower my eyes. I let the cold, lethal composure I had been building for the last 48 hours completely overtake my features. "The person whose name is on this forged guarantee invited him," I answered. My voice was pure, absolute ice. Victor stared at me, his mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out. He looked at the blank piece of paper I had left on the table. He looked at the notary, who was now furiously writing detailed notes in her logbook, documenting the entire outburst. And finally, he looked back at Evan. Evan placed his tablet flat on the slate table. "I am going to ask a series of simple, direct questions," he announced, tapping the screen to bring up the forensic metadata. "Given the fact that there is a licensed notary present and a verbal confession of document manipulation has already been witnessed, I strongly suggest you answer truthfully." Evan did not wait for their consent. He turned his unblinking gaze directly to Denise. "Did you physically hold the device that received the two-step verification code necessary to bind this commercial liability?" Evan asked, his tone flat and rhythmic. Denise opened her mouth, her lips trembling violently. She looked at Victor, pleading for a lifeline, but he was paralyzed. She could not formulate a lie fast enough. Evan immediately pivoted to Roman. "Did you utilize the disbursed funds to float your commercial operations, knowing with absolute certainty that the guarantor had zero knowledge of the transaction?" Roman swallowed hard, staring at his expensive leather shoes, refusing to make eye contact with the investigator. Evan turned his attention to Victor. "Did you systematically route the warning letters and legal notices to an address where the primary victim did not reside, utilizing a fabricated email account created specifically to intercept communications?" Victor clenched his jaw, his hands curling into tight fists at his sides. He refused to speak, but Denise, completely broken by the rapid-fire interrogation and entirely misunderstanding how legal liability worked, tried one last, desperate time to play the benevolent martyr. "We were not trying to hurt her," Denise cried out, thick tears spilling over her heavily powdered cheeks. "I only read those letters so she would not know too early. I just wanted to protect her from the stress until we could fix the business." Evan stopped entirely. He slowly reached down and tapped a single button on his tablet, officially logging the statement into the permanent case file. Denise had just sealed her own downfall. In her desperate, twisted attempt to paint herself as a protective mother, she had definitively confessed to the intentional, ongoing concealment of a financial crime. She was no longer a bystander caught in the crossfire. She was a documented accomplice in a coordinated federal cover-up. The glass door opened one final time. Tessa Monroe walked into the boardroom. She moved with the silent, terrifying grace of a predator who had finally cornered its prey. She completely ignored my parents and my brother. She walked straight to my side of the table, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. She carried a single, crisp legal document. It was not a ratification file. It did not have the logo of Roman's failing construction company printed on it. Tessa reached over and placed the paper precisely over the blank sheet I had been staring at all night. Printed in bold. Uncompromising black ink at the very top of the page were the words, Federal Identity Theft Affidavit and Request for Fraud Investigation. Victor looked down at the title of the document resting perfectly in front of my hands. His face went entirely slack. The aggressive, domineering posture melted away, leaving behind nothing but the hollow, terrified shell of a man who realized he had engineered his own absolute destruction. He finally understood the architecture of the trap. The emergency meeting he had so aggressively demanded, the high-pressure environment he had so carefully laid to force my compliance, had never been his trap at all. He had marched his entire family into a locked room, completely isolated them from legal counsel, and formally verified every single piece of evidence I needed to lock them away. I picked up the heavy metallic pen I had left resting on the slate table. I did not pull the thick manila folder containing their desperate ratification document toward me. Instead, I reached out and pulled Tessa's document directly into the center of my workspace, the Federal Identity Theft Affidavit. I uncapped the pen. The room was so profoundly quiet, I could hear the faint scratch of the nib against the thick paper as I signed my full legal name. I pushed the document across the smooth surface toward the notary. She reviewed my government identification, logged the transaction in her leather-bound journal, and pressed her heavy brass stamp onto the bottom of the page. The loud, definitive thud of the stamp echoing in the boardroom was the sound of my absolute emancipation. Evan Pike immediately reached out and took possession of the notarized affidavit. He tapped the screen of his encrypted tablet, officially logging the sworn victim statement into the lending institution's central server. By receiving this sworn affidavit, Evan announced, his voice entirely devoid of emotion, I am immediately freezing all civil collection actions against the named guarantor, Skyla Flores. Furthermore, based on the documented digital forensics, the audio recording, and the verbal admissions witnessed in this room tonight, I am officially activating a comprehensive internal fraud investigation against Copper Ridge Habitat Group and its primary operators. Tessa stepped forward, placing herself physically between my chair and my father. Let me make the next phase perfectly clear, Tessa stated, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. As of this exact second, I am acting as the sole legal proxy for Skyla Flores. You will not call her. You will not text her. You will not appear at her residence or her place of employment. Any further attempt to contact my client directly, or any effort to coerce her into withdrawing this affidavit, will be immediately documented and submitted to the authorities as retaliation and witness tampering. If you wish to discuss this matter, you will direct your communications exclusively to my law firm. The polished, domineering patriarch completely vanished. Victor panicked. He lost total control over the volume and pitch of his voice. He lunged forward, his hands slamming against the table. You cannot do this to me, he bellowed, the veins in his forehead pulsing visibly under the harsh fluorescent lights. I am your father. I gave you everything. You are going to destroy my entire life over a piece of paper. When his raw aggression failed to make me flinch, his strategy violently shifted. The anger dissolved into pathetic, breathless begging. He reached out, his fingers grasping at the empty air above the table. Please, Skyla, please. Withdraw the paper, I will pay you back. I will sell the cabin. I will give you the equity. Just tell them it was a misunderstanding. Please, you are killing me." When I remained entirely silent, staring at him with the cold detachment of a stranger, Victor pivoted a third time. He turned his desperate, furious eyes toward my brother. "This is your fault," Victor screamed, pointing a shaking finger at Roman. "It was your pathetic, failing company. You dragged us into this. You tell them you did it." Roman did not argue. He did not defend himself. My brother, the golden child who had spent his entire adult life being shielded from the consequences of his own incompetence, finally revealed his absolute cowardice. He looked at the investigator, looked at Tessa, and then looked at the heavy glass door. Without uttering a single word, Roman turned his back on his parents, pushed the door open, and practically ran down the executive corridor. He was not the mastermind of this fraudulent architecture, but he was the primary beneficiary who had comfortably used his sister as a human shield for years. And the moment the shield was removed, he abandoned the people who had built it for him. Denise shattered completely. The pristine, lavender-scented facade she wore like armor dissolved into ugly, gasping sobs. "I only did it to keep the family from collapsing," she wailed, her hands clutching the edges of her designer handbag. "We were drowning. We just needed a bridge. I had to keep the family together." Her hysterical justification was the ultimate confirmation of her guilt. She knew exactly how unethical and illegal their actions were. She knew the boat was sinking. She simply chose me as the sacrifice because she genuinely believed I was too compliant, too desperate for their love, and too intimidated by my father to ever fight back. But they were too late. The hallway security cameras, the front desk reception logs, the sworn notary, and the federal investigator had completely locked the timeline. There was no alternate narrative they could spin. The trap had closed. I stood up, buttoned my charcoal blazer, and walked out of the boardroom without looking back. During the next 4 weeks, the heavy machinery of the legal system dismantled the nightmare they had built. Using the identity theft affidavit and the corresponding digital evidence, the massive commercial debt was entirely severed from my name. My credit score was restored to its pristine state. The lending institution, armed with Evan Pike's comprehensive fraud report, redirected their aggressive recovery efforts entirely toward the people actually responsible. I received a brief, formal update from Tessa informing me that a significant portion of Victor's private holding company assets had been legally frozen to facilitate a massive civil recovery lawsuit. I did not stop at simply clearing my name from the defaulted loans. I instructed Tessa to file a permanent, binding legal injunction against my parents and my brother. The court order explicitly prohibited them from utilizing any of my personal data. My physical address, my email accounts, my social security number, or any variation of my signature on any future documentation, under threat of immediate criminal prosecution. For the first time in my entire existence, I did not try to reason with them. I did not engage in a screaming match. I simply cut the cancerous tumor out of my life using the cold, unyielding blade of the law. Exactly 1 month after the disastrous family meeting, I stood on the expansive rooftop terrace of my apartment building. I had arranged a private, catered dinner to celebrate my belated 33rd birthday. There were no cheap supermarket sheet cakes. There were no fake smiles. The only people in attendance were Tessa, Miles, and a few close colleagues from Solstice Vector Mobility who genuinely respected me. I held a glass of expensive champagne, leaning against the glass parapet, looking out over the sprawling city of Tempe. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the Arizona sky in brilliant, violent streaks of crushed violet and burnt orange. Down in the private resident parking lot, the sleek, phantom black silhouette of my $95,000 electric vehicle was perfectly reflecting the dying light of the desert sunset. I took a slow sip of my drink, the cool liquid grounding me in the present moment. I finally understood the absolute truth of my father's reaction outside the hotel. When Victor saw that car, he was not intimidated by its retail price. He was horrified by what it represented. It meant I was no longer a piece of family property. I was no longer an invisible asset waiting to be leveraged, depleted, and discarded to maintain their illusions of success. I belonged entirely to myself. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below and let me know your city or country, and share your thoughts on how everything unfolded. If you enjoyed this journey, please make sure to subscribe to the Violet Revenge Stories channel, leave a like on this video, and support the channel even more by hitting that hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.